So thanks to everybody who stuck around for the final panel here. We really appreciate it. We have a great collection of folks here. I'm going to do very abbreviated bios of everybody on the stage because there's half a dozen of us and because you have the bios in your book. So if you want to learn more about them, you can read the book, and if you want to be creepy, you can Google them, you can do whatever you like. So we are joined by, let's see, in the order that they are sitting, I'll go from your that way to this way, I can't figure it out. At the far end of the table, we have Andrew Chavez from the Dallas Morning News. He's a data journalist at the Morning News. Next to him, you've already met Manik-Perlman, so he needs no introduction. Next to him is Sue Hale, who you've already met. This is easy. Then we have Tamara Manik-Perlman. She's co-founder and CEO of NextRequest. It's one of the portal organizations that we heard about during a session yesterday. Next to her, we have Ginger McCall, who's the first public records advocate for the state of Oregon. And we have Tom Susman, who's the International Policy Coordinator and Strategic Advisor for the American Bar Association. So the idea, what we're going to do is we're going to have these guys who all represent different facets of the FOIA and access world, talk about their roles and sort of what they've seen. Then we want to talk a little bit about what's probably coming next. And we're going to open this up for conversation with all of you. So thought we'd kick things off. Sue, if you don't mind kicking things off, that'd be great.
Okay, well, hello again. Mark and I all talked about this, and he said, why don't you talk about lessons from the past? And I alluded to this earlier, but one of the lessons is we have to have constant vigilance, because every time we turn around, there's some law that's being added to another law that you wouldn't expect that will weaken the Open Records Act and the Open Meeting Act that we have right now. The other thing is, we needed, I see from the past that what we did right was we had groups representing the coalition that y'all just passed out. We had the League of Women Voters, we had representatives from SBJ, we had attorneys. Thank goodness we'd never figured out how to write the bylaws or get the 501c3. We had people that brought diversity. We even had a parliamentarian. I'm not exactly sure why he was there, but he was great. You know, he really knew what he was doing. We had the librarians, which I mentioned earlier. So a diverse group of people, and that's still very much how the board is. It's very diverse, and it really represents all places in the state, including the smaller groups and the Oklahoma Press Association. What I see going forward with this kind of group is that we have to get more young people involved in that are already in college, in journalism school, and there is no reason why they can't join the FOI board or become an active member on FOI, or somehow recruit them to be part of this group so that they have a whole circle of friends that we don't. You know, and we are utilizing social media. We are, trying to do Twitter and all of the other things, but we really need these kids who are so smart and know exactly how to reach out and engage their community. And we're not reaching that community. So, and that's something that we had problems with when we started. We basically had an idea that we wanted to reach the citizens, that we wanted to educate, and we did go into communities. We reached out to government. You'd be amazed at how many new legislators have no idea we even have openness laws. We are still doing this, We are still going out to these people in small communities and saying, hey, guess what? You can't have a meeting without posting an agenda. Really? I mean, they come from a business community. They don't understand these things. And so we learned that, but you have to continually train. You cannot just stop and say, okay, we've reached everybody in the state. I learned this as an editor, I had to go around to all my young folks and say, how many of you know the five rights we have under the First Amendment. Where did you go to school? I mean, it was embarrassing. I had one young man who got them all five, and he was from Scotland. So I'm like, okay, I have work to do. And we all have work to do in that regard. So we learned that. Here's a couple of ideas that we used that I think were worthwhile, and we still do it. We have a Black Hole Award, and that is for someone in the state who has totally ignored the laws or refused to prosecute, and rarely in Oklahoma does any DA want to prosecute any of this, right? So we have a Black Hole Award for the most egregious. One of them became part of the Trump administration. He had Black Hole Award twice. And you know, even our governor, we're not afraid. She got the Black Hole Award, previous governor. So, but we also give out awards to people who are not necessarily journalists, but who actually went out and they get it, and they're teaching, and they're doing the volunteer work. So we're learning, we're still learning. We're still learning from the past, but we're still learning what other things will work. And I can tell you one thing. One other thing we kept talking about today was lack of money. And I would probably never do this again, but I got this crazy idea from Nancy that I should have a dinner for one very beloved Supreme Court justice, and sell tables to all the attorneys in town, because they all came, and we raised $40,000 in one night, and we used that money to do the program I talked about earlier called Education for Freedom. And so you can figure out ways to bring money into your organization. It's not easy and it's not fun, but you also have to team up with your small newspapers. You have to team up with anybody who will listen. And I still believe, I still am an optimist. I still believe it's going to work eventually. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks. Mitch, do you want to?
So I've been working in the FOI community for about 45 years. First as part of an enforcement agency and litigator, and later as doing lobbying work and joining the Connecticut Coalition, the Connecticut Foundation for Open Government. And for the last 14 years now, I've been teaching media law to journalism students at the University of Connecticut. And that's been an education. What I found out, and these are mostly seniors about to graduate. My course is a required course for journalism degree. And I found out they know nothing about the First Amendment. But even more significant to me is about half of them don't think it's that important.
Right.
And they're future journalists. So this is going back 15 years and it's not getting any better. So with this point of view, I went back to CFOG and I said, you know, we've been doing a lot of public education. We'll speak to lots of groups and have lots of different programs, but why don't we start to concentrate on younger people? So we put together a curriculum in which, which we piloted for about half a dozen colleges and high schools, pairing a lawyer with a journalist to talk about the various freedom of expression provisions, particularly of the First Amendment. And we offered this free. We thought teachers would love it. They would take a day off and fit into the core curriculum for Connecticut schools. And we've been totally underwhelmed by participation. So we, in each program was well received by a particular teacher, but fighting the educational bureaucracy was very hard. So we decided that we couldn't really go and do college students and high school students. We were going to concentrate on high school students, get them when they were closer to whatever civics courses they had, whatever they had in primary schools. And So we spent the second year just going out to those schools. Again, and we had the total support of the State Department of Education as commissioner. We did about a half a dozen programs, just could not generate interest. When we looked at it, we said, well, we can't understand it, what's going on here. So we had been working to get younger people into our coalition, and we said, is there a way that we're teaching this that may fall flat with younger generations? And they worked up, with more visual and even comedical aspects to show these as cartoons, videos, and I thought it was terrific. I mean, I'll probably use those pedagogical techniques in my own teaching, but again, not much interest from the teachers. So when we talked at our meeting with the younger people, what would interest students and teachers how to do this? One of our board members who works for NPR said, well, I've been working on this concept of having a series of multimedia interactive teaching programs designed to show the relevance of the First Amendment, civic engagement, and media awareness, media literacy. Mm-hmm. And he had done a sort of a little pilot on it. And I said, well, this is not a bad idea. Why don't we focus, instead of high school, in junior high school? Because we looked at the curriculum, it fits nicely into the curriculum, and we don't have to send people or organize it. We can put these things on a digital medium and let the teachers use that, including as part of their homework and instruction, and get the kids to participate in it, what's important to them. So for the next year or two, that's what we're going to be working on, putting together this series of interactive multimedia videos, which by all of them, putting all of them together will be very expensive. We have to get all good enough production values and so forth. So we are starting to work with other organizations like Public Television, NPR in our state, and other groups where we'll provide the material, and they'll provide maybe the people who can do this thing online and be more entertaining and put this out in a way that teachers would love to incorporate this into their social studies program. 2 or 3 years down the road, when this is complete, I'll be happy to come back and report on its success or failure.
Is this working? Can you hear me? Perfect. So just by way of background, I am a Freedom of Information Act litigator. I started off my career at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, where I was for about 6 years after I had a brief stint at the Sunlight Foundation. And then I moved on to the U.S. Department of Labor. While I was at EPIC, I was litigating FOIA lawsuits on the plaintiff's side. While I was at the U.S. Department of Labor, I was defending FOIA lawsuits. So that was educational. And then an interesting opportunity came up about 1.5 years ago. The state of Oregon had created a public records advocate position, which looked interesting to me because in my time in DC, I had watched the Office of Government Information Services get off the ground. And this public records advocate position was supposed to be a lot like the Office of Government Information Services. It was supposed to be a public records ombuds position, providing facilitated dispute resolution and training on public records issues. And so I thought, well, that's an interesting opportunity. And it was actually Adam Marshall who had tipped me off to that opportunity. So I put my application in, and I figured I would never hear back from them because it was in Oregon, and I'm from Pittsburgh and lived in DC. But I guess that they were maybe looking for someone who was an outsider, because I did manage to get hired for that position, and I sold my house in Maryland and packed my 3 dogs and my husband up into my Honda Fit and spent 2 weeks driving across the country to get to Oregon. So when I got there, I found that there were a number of challenges. So first, the office that I'm starting has 3 basic responsibilities: to provide mediation or facilitated dispute resolution, to provide training on public records issues. Now, the statute only mandates that we provide training to government officials, but as you'll see in this presentation, I've taken a very broad reading of my statutory mandate. So I've also been providing training to the public as well. And then I'm tasked with leading the Public Records Advisory Council, which is a council that was created by the legislature. In 2017, there were a whole bunch of new public records provisions that were added to the statute in light of a corruption scandal involving the former governor. So my job came out of that. But one of the other things that came out of those changes is the Public Records Advisory Council, which has several responsibilities. The first is conducting surveys of government bodies across the state of Oregon to gather information about their public records performances and practices. And the second is to create policy proposals, legislative or policy proposals that will improve transparency in the state of Oregon. Now, one of the primary challenges that I encountered as soon as I started the job is that this council, which I head and which is the proper vehicle really for proposing policy changes, was set to expire on January 1st of 2021. So that's not a lot of time that this council has to survive. So one of the first things that I wanted to do was to ensure the continued survival of that council. Some of the other challenges were the fact that we had a very ambiguous statute. The statute that created my office was the result of a long political battle. And as the result of that long political battle, there are a lot of ambiguities in the statute. It's unclear, for instance, who I report to. It's unclear whether I can provide facilitated dispute resolution to only state agencies or also to cities and counties and special districts and other government bodies. There were a lot of places in the statute where the statute is fairly ambiguous. So I had to deal with that, and also the difficult political situation that created my job, that there was a Republican Secretary of State and a Democratic governor, and my office spans the space between. My office doesn't belong to either of those government bodies. That was the compromise that they came to. It was originally going to be under the governor, and then there was a fight, and the Secretary of State actually appointed someone to my position before the position was really created, and then there was more of a fight, and then the compromise position was that I am housed in the Secretary of State's archives building, appointed by the governor, but with the permission of that Public Records Advisory Council, which is supposed to expire in 2021. So you can see the sort of fun situation that I stepped into here. Also, I'm an outsider. I didn't know anyone in Oregon before I moved there. I had no political connections to Oregon. I was just relying on the good graces of the other folks that I was working with. And thankfully for me, everyone in the archives and the Secretary of State's office and the folks in the governor's office have been very helpful as I have started off this office. But as an outsider, that definitely created some problems. Oregon is also a state with a lot of geographic and political diversity. You hear about those news stories where there are warring political factions literally fighting each other in the street. That's in Portland. That is characteristic of the political situation in the state of Oregon. There's a big divide in Oregon between Portland and everything that's on the western side of the mountains, and all of the relatively empty space that's on the eastern side of the mountains. And the political divide mirrors that. So I had to navigate that as well and create an office that could do outreach to everyone across the state, whatever their political affiliation. And I also walked into a situation where there was a total lack of data. I stepped into the state and I asked naively, well, how many public records requests do state agencies in the state of Oregon receive per year? I was coming from the federal government. The federal government has very robust annual reporting requirements, and everyone just looked at me and shrugged. I would ask an agency, how many requests do you receive in a year? And they would just shrug. They don't know. They have no idea. So that lack of data made it fairly difficult to move forward. And you'll see that's one of the things that I'm actually hoping to remedy. So I put together a plan. I literally typed out a strategic plan for my first year there. And I have it hung up on my wall, and I have check marks next to the things I've already accomplished. Targeted outreach is one of the biggest things that I found to be integral to the success of my office. I have looked up all of the newspapers in the state. If I'm traveling in the area, I reach out to the media representatives who are there. I have meetings with them. I spend a lot of time just listening to people. I did outreach to a lot of government offices, to advocacy organizations, to students, especially journalism schools, and we're working on some outreach to the native tribes in the state of Oregon. I also tried to establish a good social media presence. You can find me online at OregonPRA, that's my Twitter handle. And we have a website which we're hoping to revamp to put information up, resources about Oregon's public records law. We have a good collaboration with the folks in the archives. A lot of times when we travel around the state to do trainings, we do those trainings with the record retention folks because record retention issues and public records issues go hand in hand. So the record retention folks come in and they train the agency on what their record retention responsibilities are, what is a public record, and then I step in and train them on their responsibilities under the public records law, what the new deadlines are to respond, what the rights of appeal are, what exemptions can be applied and what shouldn't be applied, what fees can be charged and what fees can't be charged. So we do it hand in hand, and that saves us money as we're traveling, but it also, I think, covers more ground in what would be relevant in a public records presentation. And I've used the expertise of my counsel. So in the first year, I've trained about 1,500 people. I've done about 150 requests for assistance. We have 2 legislative proposals, one of which is to make that Public Records Advisory Council permanent, and the other is to create 4 basic annual reporting requirements for state agencies in the state of Oregon. Just how many records are they receiving? How many records are still requests are still outstanding after the 15 business day deadline in the statute? How many record requests are still outstanding after 60 days? And how many requests for fee waiver or reduction are they granting and denying? So 4 basic data points, but you wouldn't believe the pushback that we've gotten about this. I think it's a pretty low lift, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to get both of those pieces of legislation passed. But it's been a very educational process on how the legislative system works in the state of Oregon. We also issued a report to the governor and the legislature last December, which made some waves. As I said before, I've taken a fairly expansive reading of my statutory duties, and I've tried to be ambitious in this. I have in fact been told by powerful government individuals that I have been too ambitious, but I take that to be a compliment. I think that the goal here is to try to do whatever I can to improve the law in the state. My appointment is 4 years, and at the end of that 4 years, I would very much like to leave the state better off than I found it. So we issued our report, and it noted what I had seen as I was traveling around the state and talking to folks on the government side and the requester side. What were the systemic issues in the state of Oregon? And I figured that I was probably better positioned than many other people in the state to actually speak to this, because I had spoken to folks across the political spectrum, across the geographic area of the state, people who were requesters as well as people who were responding to requests on a daily basis, and I was starting to see some patterns. And in the absence of data, all I have is anecdotes. So I thought I will put the information that I have about those patterns down in this report. And so we issued a report, and sort of indirect results of that have been at least 2 of the recommendations that I made in the report have been introduced as legislative proposals by other bodies. And there has been a major change in the practices of the Portland Police Department regarding citizens' access to police reports, and that was also something that I noted in my report. So I have seen anecdotally that there have been some changes that are at least indirectly a result of that report. I've also assisted Open Oregon, which is Oregon's Open Records Coalition, in a new public records guide with updates from that 27 law. I've done a lot of outreach to the news media, and we did some Sunshine Week celebrations. We honored good government actors who were nominated by the public, and we also recognized journalists who were using public records to put together stories. We had a gallery of stories that were made possible only by public records. Just real quick. So I have heard that there are other states that have similar offices. I would encourage you and your coalitions to work on building offices like this and creating legislation that creates these offices. It really does it goes a long way to facilitating communication and to having someone in a position who's actually within the government but not fully a part of it, who can advocate for transparency proposals effectively.
Thanks. Tom?
Thank you. Mine is the federal perspective, and when I hear some of the numbers talked about, it leads me to want to begin with sort of a profile of what we're up against at the federal level, which is the last year in which information was available, fiscal 2017, over 800,000 requests. Homeland Security and Justice Department, the 2 agencies most often involved. Over 100,000 backlog, the oldest being 25 years old. 4,500 full-time employees, and over $500 million estimated cost for FOIA. Now, to put that in perspective, I think they estimate that military bands is about 900 million, and maintaining golf courses for the military, for the Defense Department, is about 450 million. So 500 million sounds like a big number until you think of, what the federal government spends on things. Lawsuits, according to TRAC, record high last year, over 400, which is, over 400 average during the Obama administration, 800 the first year of the Trump administration, and continuing to climb. Rising number of nonprofits filing lawsuits, and good news, a dramatic increase in suits by news organizations and reporters. AP and the New York Times leads the way with AP, BuzzFeed. Jason Leopold is part of the top 5. Subject matter, mostly official misconduct and misuse of government funds. Along with this, the Federation of American Scientists, Stephen Aftergood, estimates that the leaks of classified information in the past 2 years have reached also an all-time high. Okay, put this together, spikes in requests, spikes in lawsuits, spikes in leaks over the last 2 years. Why is that? It's a 5-letter word, TRUMP. The president sort of sets the stage for things, and this is a problem. And this isn't, these are descriptions, not criticisms or political commentary, but the president did sort of set the tone with describing media as the enemy of the people, with objecting to release of an Inspector General's report in the Department of Defense as insane because, quote, the public means the enemy. We all know about there's a long list. I could take the next 30 minutes reading it, but tax returns, FBI, crime report, climate change, meeting with Putin, waivers to ethics rules, cabinet and White House use of private email accounts, suspended participation in open government partnership, agencies being told not to respond to individual members of Congress, or Democrats making requests for information from agencies, et cetera. It's a long list. That sets the tone at the top. And so the question becomes, well, what do we have to look forward to? Well, I've been in Washington for a long time, and the pendulum swings. And I guess right now, that's good news. We heard the story, President Johnson down at the ranch, 1966, do I sign it, don't I sign it? Every federal department and agency said no. Most White House advisors said no. The media was strongly supportive. Johnson was worried about his image in Vietnam, and he signed the bill, but with great reluctance. And the histories are really good. He said, no ceremony, this is all going to be very quiet, even though the language was pretty rhetorically strong. But executives in cities, states, federal agencies for decades, and in nations across the world that have adopted freedom of information laws, the government's always hostile to it. The line bureaucrats, the political officials don't like it because on balance, they prefer secrecy to openness. So, where does this put us for the future? Well, a bit of good news is that checks and balances is still alive. And that's the one thing that gives me some optimism. Yogi Berra said, it's really tough to make predictions, especially about the future. But I would say, I would hazard prediction that it's been a tough slog so far for the last 50 years of freedom of information, and it will be tough going forward. As Mitch said earlier, it's a continuing battle. The courts have historically been on our side. Independent, objective. I mentioned yesterday in a question that the chief judge in the District of Columbia Court responded to a question of, isn't there too much FOIA litigation? And she said, that shows the law is working. We have our challenge. Next month, there's an argument before the U.S. Supreme Court. That's our version of the Texas Boeing case, the question of whether the Business confidentiality exemption will be interpreted as sweeping and unfettered, or whether it will continue to be cabined to what has been a workable historic interpretation for the last 40 years. We'll find out. Congress, as you saw from Senator Cornyn's video yesterday, working with Senator Leahy, has been bipartisan through the years, always. On the House side, congressmen from both sides of the aisle who don't agree on anything else come together on freedom of information. So that's why I conclude that I'm optimistic but worried. I think that there are things going on at the federal level now. There's an advisory committee that's the third term of a 2-year advisory committee that makes recommendations, that joins government FOIA officials with private sector advocates and finds agreement on paths forward for improving the law and its administration. Records management is probably the big challenge for the future. Electronic records coming in and difficulty of maintaining, searching, etc. But in the end, I've been in this arena for a long time. And I expect to stay in it for a long time to come because I do see progress to be made. Thanks.
Andrew?
Sure. So my perspective on this is mainly that one of a frequent user of the law. And I would say that as I think about the future, I think a lot about how the law is not always very well equipped to deal with complex requests for digital information, and how it's not necessarily because we're making more complex requests. It's actually because the way that information is stored is increasingly more complex. And I would say that out of the hundreds of requests that I have sent over the last couple of years, that I have probably spent a third of my time on maybe 10 of those requests that were for data or for information. And we say that it's data, but it's not, it doesn't mean that it's numbers. It means that it was, the thing that, was once a police report that was typed into a form and stuck in a folder is now, all of these fields that are split up and are living in a series of databases, some maybe in the cloud, some maybe in some proprietary vendor software, some in someone's, an access database on someone's computer. And I've really found that the law is not always very well equipped to handle those cases. In all of the cases with these more complex requests, I feel like anybody who's being intellectually honest and looking at what is being asked for would say that the information itself is open. The information itself, if it were sitting in a piece of paper in a folder in someone's desk drawer, you would never be able to dispute that it's releasable. But that the way that it is stored has become a huge stumbling block for getting access to this information. And, there are cases where agencies employ very savvy people who are, open to working with you to get that information. But when the law doesn't provide a framework that assures that, you end up with people being able to selectively hide behind that complexity. And in terms of looking forward and being optimistic about this, though, the good news is that, we're not talking about needing to expand the law to include new types of information. It's really just about the storage. And it's really about, what can you reasonably expect from a government agency for them to go out and gather this information for you? What types of file formats can you expect? What types of, what's a reasonable amount of work that an agency should have to put in to extract this digital information and return it to you? This is a great thing for journalists, and I'm sure anyone who wants to use public information, because when you get it, it's way more powerful than it would be sitting in a bunch of paper files. But it is way more complicated to get, and I think that complexity has turned into something that can be used to sort of beat down anyone who is not willing to persist and fight through to get that information. And so, you know, as I see the laws evolving in Texas, I see a lot of stuff that is changing just around that process. And I think to the extent that laws nationwide are going to evolve, the more that they can sort of outline that process, which is way more complicated, the better we will see us able to maintain access to that information. Yeah.
Good point.
Hi, so by way of introduction, I am the CEO of NextRequest, which is one of the companies that provides public record software to agencies to help them make their process easier to manage, both for requesters and for them. But actually, I started off as a data scientist and made FOIA requests early on in my career, in particular around a voter ID law in Pennsylvania, and really understanding what would the disparate impact of that law be on communities of color. And at the time, what they wanted to do was tell me, hey, here's this giant paper binder of voter registration information. You can go through this page by page. And luckily, we were able to get the information in a digital format because of a friendly person on the inside. But I empathize strongly with the challenges that everyone here is going through because I've gone through them myself. I also, as someone who works on a regular basis with people in government, empathize with the challenges that they're facing. So I guess I'll share a little bit about sort of what I've seen in working with government agencies. I think the biggest challenge for a lot of them is producing the records. I think, as a number of people have said, if it was just a piece of paper in a drawer, it made sense that FOIA was a sort of reactive process where you said, okay, yeah, someone had an anecdote about how you could walk into, maybe it was in Maine, an office and just pull out their budget book and look at it back in the day, which is fascinating and amazing. And I think there are now digital analogs to that. But in many ways, I imagine this process developed because there were files where it wouldn't be appropriate to just let people walk into an office and sort of go through the file drawers without knowing what was being taken. But what I would say is that, from my perspective, I do think fundamentally that that's where we want to help agencies go with the software that we develop. Because I think, a lot of the discussion that's going on here presumes that this is a reactive process where the records exist, you can't access them directly, you have to make a request, there's a bunch of back and forth around redaction. And as someone who works with data, I think that people should be taking a step back and really thinking about how to work with these agencies, A, to make information available on open data portals, but B, and this isn't necessarily the thing that you're interested in, but how to talk to government agencies about working with software vendors who write software that make that information easily accessible through databases. I think one of the challenges that a lot of agencies face is that they're working with software vendors who I won't name, but a lot of legacy vendors who actually make that information incredibly difficult for the agencies themselves to access. There are agencies we work with who are paying software vendors where they have a limited number of queries that they themselves can make against police reports because of the structure of their contracts. So I would say that there's a very fundamental problem about how information is stored and managed in governments, and it's a challenge that you all are facing sort of on the end of trying to access those records, but it's actually a problem that the people in the agencies themselves are facing when they're trying to access their own information, whether it's in order to fulfill a public records request or even to communicate between departments within an agency. So this isn't necessarily the issue that interests you most, but I would say that this is a very fundamental problem that I think needs to be addressed before this process can be efficient for anyone who's involved. I'd also say, again, that I think one of the big challenges that agencies are facing is around both the volume and type of media that are being requested of them. So increasingly, communication is taking the form of text messages, emails, but I don't know if anyone here, maybe this is the millennial question, uses Slack, which is sort of a chat app. I know some people in a federal agency where their agency was being audited, and so they were required to provide the transcripts from Slack, but being millennials, a lot of the communication was in the form of emoji, right? It's a little bit like, acrostics or those little puzzles where you're trying to figure out what something means because you've combined, a heart with a clover. But the way that you could export from that system was not in the form of emoji, it was in the sort of text description of what that emoji was. So when people were looking at these records, it was this like absurd string of descriptions. So I think that really understanding that there's a challenge around the way that people are communicating and figuring out how to access that information, but also to process it at scale. Because when you're requesting these kinds of information from governments, I know that they're spending a ton of time both getting that information, but then figuring out how to review it. In the cases of the customers that we work with, we believe not to improperly withhold information, but really to protect the privacy and personally identifiable information or other sensitive information that might be in there. And then the second big challenge is around new forms of media. So increasingly, people are asking appropriately for video from body cameras or dash cameras, audio from 911 calls. But if you can imagine, the agencies who are tasked with responding to these requests are spending hours, hundreds of hours trying to redact this information. And increasingly there are tools that can help them do things like identify text like license plates or prescription bottles or faces. But a lot of agencies, especially the small governments that we work with, local municipalities, don't have the resources to buy that kind of software. And we know of agencies that are simply getting rid of those kinds of devices because they can't afford to store the video that's being generated, and they certainly can't afford to manage that information. So it's a challenge that they're facing. So I think the last thing I'd say, since I think we're running close on time, is just that for you and for your membership, I imagine it's really important to really understand, what is a public record now and how are these being managed, and maybe there are ways that you can really think about addressing access to this information further or earlier in the life cycle. We think a lot about integrations, and the software that we build really manages one part of the process, which is communicating with requesters and releasing, and in some cases redacting documents. But what we want to do and what we think needs to happen in the future is really understanding where that information, where that data lives earlier, and how to make it easier, certainly for the agencies to find and identify that when they're responding to requests, but actually, as part of the bigger picture, what are the ways that we can identify information or databases that don't contain sensitive information and make that available directly to those who are interested? And I think if you take that view of the world, one thing that's really important, one thing that I've seen from the sort of success and failure of open data portals is that often agencies will just sort of dump what they happen to have on hand, and it's not necessarily what people are interested in. But also, agencies are often sharing information, but the public isn't really equipped to search or process or use it. And so I think, there's certainly a role for data journalists in understanding and interpreting and releasing that information and turning it into an actual story so you can make sense of it. But I think another important thing would be developing tools that help the general public make sense of that information. One thing that we've noticed, we've helped the agencies that we work with handle more than 250,000 requests. They've uploaded 1 million documents. Those have been downloaded almost 4 million times. And journalists are an important constituency, but they're actually, and in terms of the volume of records that we're requesting, it's a large volume of records, but they're actually a very small minority of the people who are requesting records through open data portals like ours. The majority of people who are requesting records are just individuals who are trying to get something done, like getting information from one department to do renovations to their house, or in some cases are commercial requesters who are doing things like providing a service like environmental site assessments. So I think another thing you could do so that the concerns of journalists are addressed more is make it easier for everyone else to get their requests answered much more efficiently, because then the complex requests will have more resources that can be dedicated to them.
All right, so I had a bunch of questions, but we don't have too much time left, so I'm going to open it up first to you guys because that's the kind of guy I am in the back. Someone who's got the we have an extra mic.
Time for about one question.
Go ahead.
Listen, Ginger McCall, thanks for being here. A lot of us are watching what you're doing, and many of us are curious how we can replicate this agents in our state. I don't know if we want to replicate the ultimately dysfunctional structure of what you're in and what you're worried about. You talked a lot about your circumstance, but I wanted to know what you think a good system would be and what sort of state agency you should be under. And for Tamara, would you make more money helping agencies hide information rather than helping them expose it?
So I think a good model would be a fully independent office. And by independent, I mean not only does it not have a supervisory relationship with with an elected official, but that it is fiscally independent. Because what I found is that even if you don't have a reporting relationship with one of those elected officials, if your funds are still tied to somebody else's agency, well, then ultimately you do kind of have a reporting relationship with them. So financially independent, as well as not having that reporting relationship. One of the things that I think that they did well in my statute actually is that I can only be dismissed for cause. I think that that's an important piece. That allows me to perhaps be a bit more ambitious and issue reports that people might not like, but that might be effective at actually creating change. So I think those are some good points. And I'll think and see if I can think of anything else and hand it off to Tamara for now.
This is a question, could we make more money by helping agencies hide data? I'll answer that only slightly tongue-in-cheek, which is, we've actually talked about a number of different pricing models, and we offer a sort of light version to process a small number of requests for free to small agencies. One thing we've also thought about, because we are really interested in getting this information out there, is potentially pricing things based on the number or proportion of requests that are public versus private. Now, there's some requests that are made by someone about, an incident potentially involving a child or a police report that really shouldn't necessarily be public because it's about something that happened to you personally. But we do think about ways to incentivize agencies to actually publish more requests publicly, because we think that it's in the public interest, but frankly, it's also in their interest. If the documents that they're releasing are not sensitive, then it saves them time to publish those on the portal and make them searchable. But, agencies are risk averse, and if they don't have the tools that they need, or they make a mistake and they forget to redact some information, that can have blowback for them. So I think that it really is about providing them the tools that they need to feel confident that they're doing their jobs correctly in terms of protecting privacy appropriately.
I do have a few more thoughts. First, I think you want to draft your statute expansively. So not just a statute that allows for facilitated dispute resolution and training, but a statute that also allows for advisory opinions, that allows for reports. Now, my statute doesn't give me any enforcement ability, which is interesting. I think that was an interesting compromise. That lack of enforcement ability hampers me in some ways, because if I am doing a mediation and I see that perhaps a government agency is acting in exceptionally bad faith, I can't do anything other than find that they're acting in bad faith. But on the other hand, that lack of enforcement ability it makes me in some ways a better mediation force, because I'm not the one who's going to come and smack your hand. I'm not the one who's going to, to hit you. I'm the one who's there to cooperate, to coordinate, to collaborate with both parties. So I think that you want to ask yourself that question of whether or not you want that office to have that enforcement capability, and really think about the pluses and minuses of that.